And thank you. I know that my title, my last name are a handful, mouthful. So thank you for staying till the end of this event to listen to my presentation. And I actually wanted to pick something that has something digital, related in the context. And this is my one project, current project in this domain. So hopefully you will find it relevant for some of the work that you're doing in the digital space. And my work more recently has focused on the effects of political ideology and ideological beliefs, and I think that there could be an interesting systematic link between consumers' political ideologies and their decision to share their personal information, which is oftentimes increasingly becoming important for digital businesses. So in the space of online platforms, digital businesses, firms increasingly rely on their ability to gather personal information from customers in order to deliver their services personalized, customized, and become more efficient, and so on and so forth, and stay ultimately, be effective and profitable in the space that they're operating. And so in that context, the decision to provide or not provide personal information and which information to provide is becoming increasingly prevalent if you think about it from the consumer's perspective. And so here's just one example. When you go on a platform like let's say Pinterest, you might be browsing for some time, and at some point you might get a pop-up window that will ask whether or not you're willing to provide some personal information to this platform in order to get some news, special services, subscription, membership, and so on and so forth. And then you might be asked to indicate which type of personal information you're interested or willing to provide. And so this is an increasingly common practice in the digital space. And we're specifically interested in this context where consumers are voluntarily, proactively deciding whether or not to provide their personal data to firms. And when they're doing that in the context of, when they're browsing the products and services of companies that they're already thinking about procuring or are intending to procure. So this is a very proactive and voluntary decision that they're making. So this is not one of those contexts where, it's mandatory, or, it's something that, they would preclude them from accessing a particular product or service, okay? And so in this space, there's increasing literature in marketing and related domains examining consumers' decision to provide such information, and a lot of this literature focuses on situational and contextual factors. So, for instance, the system interface, the nature of your browsing experience on the website, platform modality, whether it's on mobile or on the computer, as well as things like the order of presentation of questions. The less intrusive the questions are, the more likely people are to provide their information. Also, what is the percentage proportion of other people who have already provided this information. All of these factors might make you more comfortable with sharing your personal data with firms. And so a lot of this literature oftentimes focuses on factors that make people more comfortable and feel safe providing their personal information. And so the challenge or the question that a lot of these papers try to address is, how can we activate or suppress oftentimes consumers' concern about privacy in order to encourage them to provide personal information to firms. Okay? In our work, we're trying to take a complementary perspective, and instead of looking at these contextual, situational, platform-specific factors, we're trying to understand whether or not there might be systematic differences across different segments of consumers in their natural propensity, inherent propensity to provide their personal data to firms. And in order to begin addressing this question, we focus on the effect of consumers' political ideologies. And just from the kind of broad perspective, we think that understanding these systematic differences across segments might be really useful to firms in order to enable them to predict, when and how they should try to be more proactive in addressing people's concerns with sharing their data. And so documenting these differences might be really helpful from that regard. And we focus on consumers' political ideologies, whether consumers are conservative versus liberal on the political ideological scale, because it's an increasingly prevalent identity characteristic that is becoming more and more useful, instrumental in driving consumer behavior, not just related to politics, but also outside the voting booth. So there's a growing literature in marketing, as well as organization behavior, psychology, and all the related fields documenting the various differences that exist between conservative and liberal individuals and how they make their decisions across multiple different domains. And in marketing, there's been, various categories of products and services that have documented these inherent differences. And so we think that it's an important variable. Also, from the practical perspective, it is something that is readily observable by firms. It is highly, reflective or related to certain characteristics such as where people live, as well as their certain behaviors, how they behave online, obviously how they vote. And so given the high observability and relevance of this factor, of this variable to consumers, to marketers, it can actually be really useful to document these differences. And at first glance, thinking about potential differences between conservatives and liberals and their propensity to share their personal information, one might expect, intuit that maybe conservative consumers would be less likely, less willing to share their personal information. Just going back to the notion that conservative ideology is oftentimes associated with a higher sensitivity to potential threats. So there has been some literature documenting that conservative individuals tend to be more sensitive, more, kind of cognizant of potential negative outcomes that might be associated with different events. And so they have a higher propensity to try to proactively manage threats. And so to the extent that providing personal information might make this the potential negative threat of having that data breached, for example, or compromised somehow salient in consumers' minds, you might potentially expect that conservative consumers might possibly be less willing to share their personal data. And we actually conducted a pilot study with some marketing managers to see whether people might actually share that intuition in their predictions about different consumer segments. And we found that the predominant majority of marketing managers, 73%, indeed thought that conservative consumers would be less willing to share their personal data with them. And we actually found no differences in that response, regardless of people's managers' own political ideologies. But we think that in this context, where consumers are increasingly more proactive and have higher agency in their decisions whether or not to share information with companies whose products and services they're already inherently interested in, that might actually make this potential threat of privacy breach a bit less salient, a bit less critical. The type of information that is typically requested by these types of platforms tends to be less threatening, more innocuous. You're not providing your social security number or your credit card oftentimes to access these services. Most of the time, you're asked for your email, some interests, personal hobbies, and so on and so forth, so that these companies can potentially customize some of the content to your liking. And so in this context where the nature of the data that is being requested is a bit less critical, and you have full control over whether or not to provide that data, we think that this threat response might be a bit less critical and instrumental in driving people's responses. And a different type of prediction might actually emerge about the effect of political ideology. And so, in fact, we think that in this context, where this privacy threat or data kind of threat might be less salient, conservative consumers might actually be more willing to provide that personal information to firms. And that might go back to their stronger belief in market efficiency or free market ideology. So this belief basically connotates or kind of denotes people's kind of perception that actors, agents in the free markets should pursue their economic goals, such as profit maximization and economic efficiency, with minimal intervention and regulation. And so actors who pursue their economic goals in this free market are more likely to be viewed by conservative consumers as being legitimate, fair, and justified. And to the extent that this practice of obtaining customers' information enables these companies to operate freely in the marketplace and provide better service, or enable their profit maximization economic activity of service provision or product provision, we think that conservative consumers will be more likely to view that request as being fair and legitimate on the part of firms. And so because of the stronger belief in free market ideology or market efficiency, we think conservatives will actually be more willing to share their personal data with firms, and that this will be explained by their stronger perception that this request for personal data is legitimate and fair. And so we have a bunch of studies, and I don't think I will have a lot of time. It's a little bit shifted here, so hopefully you can still read that, where the basic idea is that we think that there is going to be the systematic difference. Political conservatism is going to be associated with a higher willingness to share personal data with companies because of the stronger perception of this data request as being legitimate and fair. But we think that this main kind of relationship is going to be moderated, attenuated, particularly when, first of all, these firms or actors that are asking for this personal data are not operating with profit maximization or economic efficiency goals, right? So the goal of obtaining personal information is not to enable the company to operate in the marketplace, or it's for something else. And when that actor is not a free market actor, such as a nonprofit, as opposed to a for-profit firm. Plus, we think that this effect will be attenuated when privacy risk is elevated, because that's going to make everybody really hesitant to share their personal information. So I have a few, hopefully I'll show you a couple of studies going forward. So in this study, and it's once again a little bit shifted, for which I apologize, we measured people's political ideology in an elaborate way. We wanted to make sure that the effect would hold regardless of whether people subscribe themselves to a conservative versus liberal ideology because of social or sociocultural reasons or economic reasons. So we adopted a scale from the literature of social conservatism versus liberalism, as well as economic conservatism versus liberalism. And so after completing that scale, participants, read about browsing on a platform that that matches users with freelance service providers in the domains such as home improvement and delivery. And at some point, they see a pop-up asking whether or not they're willing to provide some personal information. You see some types of personal information that was highlighted. Consumers indicated whether or not they would be willing to provide this personal information on a scale from 1 to 7. We also, in most of our studies, measure privacy concerns as a way to make sure that we control for that effect when identifying the unique influence of political ideology. And we always also control for the effects of key demographic variables that might be correlated with ideology, such as age, income, education. And so we measured those variables as well. And we found that both social and economic conservatism increased people's propensity to share their personal information, and that's controlling for all these other variables. And naturally, the more concerned people are about privacy, the less they're willing to share their personal data. But what's important is that the effect of ideology holds over and above that privacy effect. We replicated this in a more realistic context where we used a simplified measure of political ideology, which is actually extremely predictive of people's preferences, conservative versus liberal, as well as Democrat versus Republican. And we had people indicate yes or no, whether they'd be willing to share their personal data to join an online panel, research panel. And we found, and this was a real behavior, people actually provided their information in order to join that panel, and we found that there was the same positive effect of political conservatism. Here, we're interested in figuring out whether there's any differences across different types of personal information that people are considering providing. And so we had people indicate, people read about testing out a beta version of a new platform, knowledge platform that provides information based on customers' needs, and that they were assigned to a condition, everybody was assigned to a condition where they were beta testing the customer profile creation function of that platform. And as part of that process, they were asked to indicate whether or not they'd be willing to provide the information about each of these different categories, which if people said that they were willing to provide that, they were actually asked to provide their personal information as part of the study. And so we looked at across how many of these categories people were willing to provide and did provide that personal information. And we categorized these different types of information into 3 buckets based on factor analysis. They pertain to personal interests, so your hobbies, your interests, your tracking behavior, so your browsing data and search behavior. Finally, personal information, your email, zip code, income. Okay? And we find that across all of these different types of information, we find a similar positive effect of political conservatism, controlling for privacy concerns and demographics. This study, just very quickly, does show that this effect is mediated by people's perception of the fairness of this request. So it was a 4-item scale to the effect of, it is legitimate for the service provider to ask for some personal information from the user, and we find that that mediated this effect. And in the last couple of studies, we found this moderation. First of all, when privacy risk is elevated because people are prompted to read the privacy policy of a website, this is a manipulation that we adopted from the privacy literature, we find that this effect is no longer there. So when privacy risk is salient because people are forced to read that privacy policy, the effect of political ideology does not hold. And finally, when the goal or the actor who's asking for that private information is not related to profit maximization. So in this case, the goal is not to let the company operate in the competitive market, but to just provide some request benefits for those users, or when the organization that is asking for this information is nonprofit, we found this attenuation effect. In fact, let me show you something along these lines, okay? So the effect holds when it's a for-profit maximization goal or company, and the effect no longer holds the political ideology here when it's not associated with profit maximization and free market ideology. And so ultimately, so I had a bit more to show here, but I'm not going to do that in the interest of time. We think that this identifies an understudied factor that drives people's online consumer behavior, specifically in the domain of sharing personal information, and that aside, accounting for individual differences across different customer segments is important. Political ideology is one of those really highly observable and relevant factors, but there might be others. And we're interested as a next step in trying to figure out, what might be some factors that might make liberal consumers more willing to provide their personal information. We've toyed around with some ideas in that space. We're still kind of working on that area, but we think that just documenting this main effect is already quite valuable. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great presentation. Question. This may be paper number 7, 8, 9, 10, or 11, but just I'd like to hear your comment on it. What about this thought of opting in versus opting out, right? So Europe has adopted a very particular perspective on the sharing of personal information. It's an opt-in type policy. The US is more of an opt-out type policy. Is that something that you think would be a moderating effect or something also worth examining?
Potentially. First of all, I want to mention that we did look into the background, like the regulatory background on kind of privacy policies and any potential political effect, in that domain. And we do tend to find that these privacy-related regulations oftentimes do garner bipartisan support. So it tends to be a less politicized issue. And it's something that both Republicans and Democrats, at least the majority of surveyed individuals, according to Pew and so on and so forth, tend to support. And so kind of that's aside, that this does not appear to be a politicized issue, or something that people are acting on explicitly when answering these questions. The second thing is that, I guess, when you are, yes, we are adopting the opt-in strategy across our studies, and all of our participants are US participants. One thing that I do want to say is that across other projects where we examined other dependent variables, we did have a significant proportion of data coming from Europe. So I did my PhD in France, I worked in the Netherlands, my co-authors are in Portugal, and so on and so forth. And we've tended to find really parallel effects. Whether or not there might be like a default option, sensitivity across conservatives versus liberals, I think is a separate interesting question. I actually would not expect that to be the case. It is relatively nuanced, to try to find ideological differences in basic decision-making strategies. So that kind of default propensity tends to be an overwhelming tendency across many different contexts. So across many different countries where this was conducted, these default studies were conducted, you would actually find very consistent effects. And so I would not expect that based on that background. Yeah.
before we get to the next one, do you see any impact on age? I think there's a belief that generational impacts, younger people might be more willing to share.
Absolutely. So which is why we also control for age. And in some of the studies, we find a negative effect of age on propensity to share. And we think that it might be related to privacy, risk concerns, for instance, as well as the lower comfort level that folks might have with these platforms, because a separate paper in this stream of research has actually shown that the more comfortable people feel utilizing a particular platform, the more willing they are to actually share. So for instance, people feel more comfortable using a mobile platform versus a website, and therefore they're more willing to share when using a mobile version of the exact same service as opposed to a website. So from that perspective, I think it all makes sense. And I do want to say that some studies have found some correlations between conservatism and age as well, and so, which is why we've always controlled for that effect. And the negative effect of age that we found is actually speaks against that being a factor in the positive effect of conservatism that we found in our studies.
This is great. I want to ask a similar question that's potentially correlated or confounded, which is rural versus urban. What does that relationship look like?
Yeah, thank you. So I think in these studies, we do not have state-level data so far and that's something that we're actually trying to brainstorm about right now. We would like to get secondary data, which is oftentimes done at a state level in the US, and in those studies, you always control for urban versus rural population. The struggle with the reason why I don't have that as part of the package so far is because identifying the DV that would be easily observable would be actually pretty difficult, because the behavior that we are interested in is something that consumers expect to be kept private between the consumer and the company, and it's not that data collection is not effectuated with the purpose of making it public, and so we think that finding reliable data sources for the DV would actually be a bit more difficult. But I would expect that given that rural versus urban correlates with these other demographics, such as income and age, I think that our effect high chance would continue to hold, given that controlling for those other correlates, we continue to find the main difference. But it is something that will be useful once we actually are able to obtain state-level data.
Have you considered, I guess, finding like a company and partnering with and doing field study, field test? Because I would imagine that there would be companies would love to work with you to figure out how to get better data from their customer base.
We're exploring that to this day, right? And so some of the other ideas that we have considered are things like VPN services, for instance, but the use of VPN services. But we think that that might be related to privacy risk as opposed to provision of personal information per se. So it's a slightly different type of kind of behavior from consumers' perspective. But so far, we haven't been able to garner the right type of partnership, I guess. But yes, that would be amazing if you have any.
Well, maybe the Institute can help you with that. I
Absolutely,
think that many companies would be fed. All the research today, I think, is so highly relevant and very relevant. Yeah, it's the best word. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Joanne, Jesse, Abigail, Abby, Layla, and Nailya. Really appreciate it. And thanks, y'all, for coming. This is the last event of the academic year. We'll kick off again next fall with these research data blitzes. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.